Hello, everyone. Today we will share the story of Gary Heidnik, a murderer and serial rapist who inspired the infamous Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs. Gary Heidnik was a priest. He was born in 1943 and had a brother named Terry. He had an unhappy childhood. His mother was alcoholic and his parents divorced in 1946, 3 years after Gary's birth. The Heidnik children couldn't get along with their stepmother, whom they hated. There was a constant atmosphere of animosity in the house. As he grew older, Gary was subjected to violence from her father. He was suffering a problem of wetting his bed, which would aggravate the situation in the house. Every morning his father would hang the wet sheet on the window of Gary's room, publicly shaming him. Gary's psychology was very much affected by his father's emotional abuse, but his father didn't care. He was also having difficulties at school. He was antisocial and was not interacting with his peers much. He reportedly had an IQ of 148. He considered himself smarter than anyone else. Once he fell out of a tree and suffered a serious head injury. After this accident, his head was damaged and kids in school started making fun of him because of this. At the age of 18, he left school and enlisted in the army upon his father's recommendations. A year later, in 1962, he was taken to the hospital due to headache and was diagnosed with mental health problems. 2 months later, he was transferred to the military hospital in Philadelphia, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. He could no longer continue his military service and was discharged due to disability status. After being discharged from the hospital, Gary stayed in Philadelphia to study nursing. He completed his training and became a licensed nurse a year later. He started a job at a hospital for veterans in 1964 but was sacked shortly due to rude treatment towards patients. Later, he started working at a hospital in Philadelphia. He was making good money. In 1967, Gary bought a 3-story house that would later be known as the House of Horrors. Due to mental health problems, Gary attempted to commit suicide several times but failed. In 1970, after his mother committed suicide by overdosing on drugs and alcohol, he tried once more, again without success. In the meantime, he founded a church called the United Church of the Ministers of God, initially with very few followers, but with time, the number of visitors grew. Gary had become a trusted preacher in the neighborhood. He opened an account. The initial deposit was $1,500. Heidnik eventually gathered over $500,000. In 1978, he had a daughter with a mentally disabled woman. Gary was renting out the other 2 floors of his house and was soon tried for assaulting one of the neighbors. After his arrest, the famous preacher was released again. His girlfriend left Gary as he was violent towards her. In 1984, Gary bought another house. That same year he married a woman named Betty Disto from the Philippines with whom he corresponded by mail. Their marriage did not last long after his wife caught Gary in bed with 3 other women. Disto filed for divorce and also requested child support payment. Betty won the divorce case. The year 1986 was the beginning of horrible events that would go down in history. He met a sex worker whom he took to his house. After having intercourse with the woman, he chained her in the basement of his house. He also dug a hole in the basement to ensure that even if she got rid of the chains, she would not be able to escape. He was on a new path now. A week later, Gary brought another woman to his house. He kept both women in the basement of his house and mistreated them. He didn't give them proper food and constantly sexually assaulted them. When 2 women were no longer enough for him, Gary kidnapped a third one. After opening her eyes, the woman saw 2 other women chained next to her. In 1987, another woman was brought to Gary's basement, bringing the number of his victims to 4. Now he was forcing the women to have sexual intercourse with one another. He would feed them with dog food and humiliate them. Another woman was brought to the basement on January 18. Gary had become unstoppable and kept imprisoning women in his house. In February, Gary killed one of the hostages, Sandra Lindsay, as a punishment for disobeying him. He took Sandra's dead body to the top floor of his house and cut her into pieces. He fed Sandra's flesh to dogs and to the women he was keeping in his basement. The dead body in his house soon caused bad odor. One of Gary's neighbors complained to police because of the smell. However, Gary was able to convince the police officers that he was cooking food. The first woman locked in Gary's basement was Rivera. Gary was using her as an assistant to torture the other women in the basement. She would help him apply electric current. One of the hostages, Deborah Dudley, was electrocuted to death during the procedure. Gary replaced Dudley with another woman. Rivera would do everything that Gary wanted her to do. She was his assistant and had gained his trust. Once she asked him for a permission to phone her family. He was convinced. He drove her to a gas station and told her that he would wait for her there. Rivera called 911 and asked the police for help. When the police arrived in the gas station, they found Rivera standing with chains on her legs. Gary the preacher was waiting for her in the car. Police surrounded the area. In 1988, Gary's lawyer tried to defend his case by claiming that his client was mentally ill and that it was River who tricked him into torturing those women. The jury was not convinced. The court found Gary guilty and sentenced to death. Gary claimed in the courtroom that the verdict was unfair, reminding that he was a disabled veteran. In 1999, he was executed by lethal injection at the age of 55 at a state correctional institution. Josefina Rivera had saved other women's lives. She had gained Gary's trust. Thanks to this trust, she was able to save herself and the other women in the basement. During an interview after her release, Rivera said she could never forget the raw smell in the basement.